Welcome to the H&R Block virtual classroom for our income tax course. Although someone may be a dependent of another, that doesn't mean they are automatically a qualifying dependent for tax purposes. Today, we will delve into qualifying dependents and support. Feel free to pause this video at any time to take notes or simply take a break. We all love a quick pop quiz, so let's look at the research question from Chapter 3. May a taxpayer claim as a qualifying dependent a foreign student brought to this country under a qualified international education exchange program and placed in their home for a temporary period? Pause and think about it. Wait for it. Wait for it. Let's see how you did. If you said no, you are correct. The answer can be found in Publication 17, page 27 under Foreign Students' Place or Residence. They are generally not U.S. residents, so don't pass this test. If they don't pass this test, they cannot be claimed as dependents. However, the taxpayer may be able to take a charitable contribution deduction for the expenses. Charitable donations are covered in the Itemized Deductions chapter. Let's look at the objectives for this chapter. There are two types of qualifying dependents for tax purposes. We will look at the rules for qualifying child, or QC, and qualifying relative, or QR. Then we will look at how to compute total support and what to do if a taxpayer has a multiple support agreement. Next, we need to understand eligibility for the Child Tax Credit, or CTC, and the other, Dependent Credit, or OBC. Of course, these topics would be nothing without our due diligence requirements and how to prepare Form 8867. Remember, in the Filing Requirements chapter, we learned about when a dependent has to file a tax return. Today, let's start with who is a qualifying dependent. I will ask you a series of questions designed to illustrate and illuminate the concepts covered in your participant's guide. Pay attention and stay focused throughout the course. That way you will get the most out of our time together. Trust me, the more you stay engaged, the more fun you'll have. The definition of a dependent illustration can be found in the Qualifying Dependents and Support chapter in the Who is a Dependent section. The chart in the participant's guide, or PG, can be incredibly helpful when it comes to understanding the difference between a qualifying child and a qualifying relative. You can use it almost like a flow chart, starting with the questions at the top and working your way down and then across. It can also be used during tax season as you are working with taxpayers with complex dependency situations. The goal of the discussion today is to help solidify your understanding of the dependency rules. What are the only two types of dependents? Qualifying child, or QC, and qualifying relative, or QR. Are the tests for a qualifying child the same as the tests for qualifying relative? No, they are different. It is how they are different that we really need to understand. But I like to start with what is the same first. Today, we will be talking about potential dependents as we work through the various dependent tests, and until we can verify that they do qualify as a dependent. Each potential dependent will have to pass the first three tests before moving on to the qualifying child or qualifying relative tests. What happens if the potential dependent fails any of these three tests? Bada boom and no bing. They are not a dependent. You can stop. There is nothing else to consider. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. Notice these are numbered. Let's start with number 1. The taxpayer cannot be a dependent of someone else, whether or not they are claimed. A dependent cannot themselves claim a dependent. If the taxpayer is a dependent of another taxpayer, then you can walk away from this chart. No reason to move on. They cannot have a dependent themselves. If they pass test number 1, what do we do next? We move on to the second test, joint return. This test states that a taxpayer cannot claim a married individual as a dependent unless the married individual is filing jointly only to obtain a refund of withholding or estimated tax paid. If the potential dependent is married and filing a joint return, you will have to find out why they are filing. If it is only to claim a refund of taxes that were withheld from their income or estimated payments they made during the year, then they pass this test. If they are filing to claim a credit such as earned income credit, then they would fail this test. But again, if they are only filing jointly to have their withholdings or estimated payments refunded, you can move on to test number 3. The third test is the citizenship/resident test. What countries can our potential dependent reside in without having to be a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident, or U.S. national to pass this test? Canada or Mexico? This test states that a taxpayer may not claim a person as a dependent unless that person is a U.S. citizen, U.S. resident, U.S. national, or a resident of Canada or Mexico. So, looking at that third test, if the potential dependent is a French citizen living in France, will they pass this third test as a dependent? No, they are not a U.S. citizen or U.S. resident alien. They are also not a resident of Canada or Mexico. They would fail this test. Again, fail this test, stop going forward. They are not a dependent. No need to look at any other tests. What if they were a U.S. citizen living in France? Would they pass? Yes, they would pass the test because they are a U.S. citizen. One exception to the citizen or resident test is for adopted children of U.S. citizens or U.S. national taxpayers. In short, an adopted child who doesn't meet the test will meet this test if they've lived with the taxpayer all year or for the remainder of the year after legal placement for adoption. Okay, the potential client has passed all three of these tests. Where do you think we move next? Qualifying child or qualifying relative? Qualifying child is correct. Let's review exercise 3.1 first. We will now walk through exercise 3.1 in your participant's guide on page 3.4. In this exercise, the taxpayer is the person named in the first sentence. For each taxpayer, indicate in the space provided whether they have a dependent using D or no dependent using ND. Remember, this is simply to determine dependency. Whether they fall under the rules for qualifying child or qualifying relative remains to be seen. For now, we'll keep our focus on dependency only. Looking at Leslie, she passes test 1 because Leslie is not a dependent. In test 2, Jack is not filing MFJ. In test 3, Jack is a U.S. citizen. Jack is a dependent. For Marcus, looking at test 1, Marcus is a dependent. The first test is failed. Quinta is not a dependent. For Carl and Carrie, on test 1, Carl and Carrie are not dependents. In test 2, Carol is only filing MFJ for refund of taxes withheld. In test 3, Carol is a U.S. citizen. All three tests are passed. For Thomas on test 1, Thomas is not a dependent. On test 2, Lucinda is not filing MFJ. On test 3, Lucinda is a resident of Mexico. All three tests are passed. For Orville and Marcia on test 1, Marcia is a dependent. The first test is failed. Kevin is not their dependent. For May on test 1, May is not a dependent. For test 2, Lee is filing MFJ to receive a refundable credit. The second test is failed. Lee is not May's dependent. Now we can consider the qualifying child tests next. For an individual to be a qualifying child of a taxpayer, an individual must meet 5 additional tests. Keep in mind, if they qualify as a dependent but don't qualify as a qualifying child, they might still be eligible to be claimed as a qualifying relative. For now, we'll keep our blinders on and only consider the rules for a qualifying child. Notice for qualifying child, we start with number 4. This is because our potential dependent had to pass the first 3 tests before we could get to test number 4 for qualifying child. It's important to note that tax preparers tend to get excited when one test is satisfied, and they often forget about the rest. They must work through all tests. With the first 3 tests we talked about, if our potential dependent fails any test, we stop, because they are not a dependent. If our potential dependent fails any of the tests from number 4 to number 8, then we immediately stop looking at the qualifying child tests. Where do we go if they failed any of the qualifying child tests? We move to the first test for qualifying relative. Test number 10. Special case number 9 will be discussed when we talk about the tiebreaker rules in the dependent-related filing statuses chapter. Next, we will look at each test for qualifying child closely, but first we will complete a check for understanding question. Which of the following tests is no to one of the first 3 dependent requirements? The taxpayer is not a dependent. Joint return. Citizenship/resident. The taxpayer must have provided over 50% of a potential dependent's support. Pause a moment and think about it. Or don't. It's your choice. If you said D, you are correct. Let's look at each answer in more detail. Taxpayer must have provided over 50% of a potential dependent's support. This is correct. In addition to not being one of the first 3 tests, it is not required of all dependents. It is only required for qualifying relative. Let's discuss why A, B, and C are incorrect. Taxpayer is not a dependent. This is incorrect. This is the first requirement to be considered a dependent. It is asking about the taxpayer, not the potential dependent, and both qualifying child and qualifying relative must pass this test first. Joint return. This is incorrect. This is the second requirement to be considered a dependent. The potential dependent cannot file a joint return unless it is only to claim a refund of taxes withheld or there was no tax liability for either spouse on separate returns. Citizenship/resident. This is incorrect. This is the third requirement to be considered a dependent. The potential dependent can fulfill this requirement by being a U.S. citizen, resident alien, U.S. national, or resident of Canada or Mexico. Congratulations on a job well done. Let's move to the first qualifying child requirement. There are only certain relationships that will pass the qualifying child relationship test. Which are the relationships that qualify? Child, which can be a son or daughter, stepdaughter, stepson, foster child, brother, sister, half-brother, half-sister, and any of their descendants. On the definition of a dependent chart, it says, or a descendant of any of them. Which relationships does this include? Granddaughter, grandson, niece, nephew, great grandchild, great niece, great nephew, and so on. What do we mean by eligible foster child? What makes an eligible foster child? They have to be placed with the taxpayer by an authorized placement agency or by a court. What about an adopted child? Do they meet this test? Adopted children satisfy the test, even if the adoption is not yet final, provided the child has been lawfully placed for adoption with the taxpayer. If they pass the relationship test, we move on to the age test. To meet the qualifying child age test, the child must once again meet certain requirements. What are these requirements? The child must be one of the following: under age 19 at the end of the year and younger than the taxpayer or the taxpayer's spouse if filing jointly. A full-time student under age 24 at the end of the year and younger than the taxpayer or the taxpayer's spouse if filing jointly. Or any age if they're permanently and totally disabled. Bonus points for answering this next question. For how many months must the child have been a student to be considered a full-time student for this test? They have to be a full-time student during some part of any 5 calendar months. The 5 calendar months do not have to be consecutive either. The educational institution dictates who is a full-time student. What type of students may this question particularly be useful for? Graduating high school students. If a child turns 19 in the same year that they graduate from high school and they don't begin college that year, they will pass the age test if they graduated in May or June, as most high school students do. Also, college students. If they are under the age of 24, they only have to attend 1 semester. As long as it was part of 5 calendar months, they pass this test. You can find this in Publication 17, page 29. So, for an age test, the last option has nothing to do with age. What is the definition of permanently and totally disabled? The potential dependent cannot engage in any substantial gainful activities because of a physical or mental condition, and a doctor has determined the condition has lasted or is expected to last continuously for at least a year or could lead to death. Uncle Bob is permanently and totally disabled. He lives with his nephew Jonathan. Would Uncle Bob pass this age test? Yes, he is totally and permanently disabled. Could Uncle Bob be Jonathan's qualifying child dependent? No. He would fail the relationship test for a qualifying child. An uncle is not an allowable relationship for qualifying child. I would like to stress the importance of considering all the requirements for dependency. Passing one of the tests alone is never enough. All tests must be passed, as we will see as we progress through this review. Now let's change the scenario. What if Bob was Jonathan's nephew? Nephew Bob is permanently and totally disabled. Would Bob, the nephew, pass this age test? Yes. He is totally and permanently disabled. Could nephew Bob be Jonathan's qualifying child dependent considering the first 2 tests? Yes, he would pass the relationship and age tests for a qualifying child. His specific age does not matter since he is permanently and totally disabled. He also does not have to be younger than Jonathan since he is totally and permanently disabled. Now let's consider Jonathan's sister Paige. She is age 23. Would she pass the first requirement relationship? Yes, a sister is one of the required relationships. Would she pass the age test? Maybe. What else would we need to know? Since she is under the age of 24, one of the things we would need to know is if she was a full-time student for some part of at least 5 months of the year. If she is a full-time student, what else would we have to consider before we could confidently state Paige passed the age test for a qualifying child dependent? Paige would have to be younger than Jonathan to pass the test. The potential dependent cannot be older than the taxpayer. If Jonathan was married, would Paige have to be younger than both Jonathan and his spouse? No, Paige would only have to be younger than Jonathan or his spouse, not both of them. Now let's examine the residency test. Fill in the blank. To meet the qualifying child residency test, the individual must have lived with the taxpayer for more than how many months of the year? 6 months. What happens if the potential dependent was born or died during the year? An individual who was born or who died during the year is considered to have met the residency test if the taxpayer's home was the child's home for more than half the time they were alive during the year. There are exceptions for children who were kidnapped and if they were temporarily absent from the home. The participant's guide lists types of temporary absences qualifying children may have. What are some of the temporary absences that you can think of? Pause to think about it, then resume when you are ready for some examples. A temporary absence does not have a statutory limit or length of time, but rather it depends on the facts and circumstances. There must be a reasonable assumption that the child will return to the household, and the taxpayer continues to maintain the household in anticipation of their return. For example, Ben, a potential dependent, is a full-time student at your state college. He is a sophomore and lives in an apartment near campus with two friends all year so he can attend classes year-round. He comes home during holidays when he has time off from his classes and stays in his childhood bedroom in his parents' home. Would his absence be considered temporary? Yes, while Ben does maintain an apartment year-round, the fact that he does return home during holidays and his parents maintain his room in their home indicates that it is a temporary absence. What if Ben is a senior and has secured a full-time job in another state that begins when he graduates in May? He will move right after graduation. Would his absence be considered temporary? No. Since Ben does not intend to return home after he graduates, his absence is not considered temporary. The next test is all about support and who provided it. To meet the qualifying child support test, the individual cannot have provided over half of their own support. Who is this test looking at specifically for total support paid? The test is looking at the potential dependent and not the taxpayer. For this test, we are only looking at the potential dependent. Did that potential dependent provide more than half of their own support? This is Samantha. She earns money acting in commercials. What happens if Samantha earned $40,000 in wages during the year from her commercials? None of the money was spent. It was all put into an account for college. Would this be part of her own support? No, only Samantha's money spent for her own support counts. If it is being saved, it is not being used for support. What if Samantha receives Social Security benefits in her name? How does that affect support? Just like with the wages, if the money was used for Samantha's support, it would be counted as support she provided for herself. What if Samantha's parents only paid 25 of her support? Would Samantha pass this test? We don't know yet. We don't have enough information. We don't know if Samantha paid more than half of her own support. What if Samantha's parents paid 25% of her support, she paid 45%, and her grandparents paid the remaining 30%? Would Samantha pass this test to be a qualifying child of her parents? Yes, Samantha did not pay more than 50% of her own support, so she would pass this test. Let's talk about what would happen if her parents paid none of her support at all. In this example, Samantha's parents did not pay any of her support. She paid 45% of her support with the money she earned in commercials, and her grandparents paid the rest. Would Samantha pass this test to be a qualifying child of her parents? Yes, again, Samantha did not pay more than 50% of her own support, so she would pass this test. It does not matter that her parents did not pay any of her support. For this test, the amount she contributes to her own support is the only thing that matters. We could exchange support from her grandparents to support received by public welfare or food stamps, and she would still pass this test as a dependent of her parents because, again, Samantha did not provide more than half of her own support. Remember, this is only one of the tests for qualifying child. Samantha would still have to pass all the other tests before she could be claimed as a dependent by her parents. So at this point, we are still only talking about the tests for qualifying child. Don't mix up this support test with the qualifying relative support test. When we move to the qualifying relative tests, we will see that the support tests are very different. For now, remember that support for a qualifying child is whether the child provided more than half of their own support. Next, we have the joint return test.